Hello, and welcome to the Red Line Book Festival. My name is Liz Corrie, and I'm the festive producer. The festival is brought to you by South Dublin Libraries and Arts. Closing out our festival is our headline event, The Art of the Glimpse, which is this year's official 2020 Red Line Book Festival book. This massive anthology, featuring 100 Irish short stories from classics right up to the current day, is edited by Sinead Gleason. Now, I'm delighted to hand you over now to Sinead Gleason to introduce this fantastic panel of contributors for this evening's event. Please enjoy.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this event to celebrate the release of The Art of the Glimpse, an amazing new anthology from Head of Zeus which gathers together 100 short stories from the Irish tradition, from the middle of the 19th century right up to today. It's a really special and beautiful book, and the perfect thing to dip in and out of over what's undoubtedly going to feel like a pretty long winter. And I think if you try and parse it out in these amazing, diverse, intriguing stories, it might go a little bit quicker for us all. So today I'm joined by three fantastic guests: Sinead Gleason, a writer and editor of the anthology, Blindboy Boatclub, and Melatu Uche Okorie, for an evening of some chats and some readings. So Sinead Gleason is an Irish Book Award-winning writer, editor, and freelance broadcaster. Having anthologised the work of others in 2016's The Long Gaze Back and 2017's The Glass Shore, she released her first book, Constellations, a collection of personal essays, in 2019. She edited The Art of the Glimpse anthology in 2020. Blindboy Boatclub is a writer, podcaster, and speaker with a #1 best-selling book under his belt already, and a podcast that has risen to fame not only in Ireland but internationally. This satirist could possibly single-handedly change people's mindset on mental health and the deafening stigma surrounding it. Outspoken and informed, Blindboy engages his audience with an unusual touch of surrealism. Melatu Uche Okorie was born in Enugu, Nigeria, and has been living in Ireland for 13 years. She has an MPhil in creative writing from Trinity College Dublin and is currently studying for a PhD in the College of Education, Trinity College, on creative writing as a way to nurture creativity in young pupils. And her wonderful book, This Hostile Life, is out from Skeen Press. So Sinead, I'd like to come to you first as editor and ask you to make the horrifically hard decision to choose some short extracts from the anthology to share with us.
Thanks so much, and thanks to both Melatu and Blindboy for their wonderful stories in the book and for joining us for this kind of closing event. It's really hard. It's the kind of Sophie's Choice sort of question. But somebody I've been quite evangelical about is a writer called Nora Holt, and I include her in this book, and I include her in The Long Gaze Back because she is the best example I can think of you can be really productive in a lifetime, you can write an awful lot of work, and you can be ultimately very highly forgotten. She only died in 1984. She published 26 books, more banned than Edna O'Brien and John McGahern, which is no mean feat. And I think her work's incredible. And the story, I'll read the extract from the book, and then I'll tell you what's going on, if you like. It's a story called 9 Years is a Long Time. It wasn't until October was well underway that she began to wonder that she'd had no word from him. Even then, she didn't actually worry. He'd probably gone on some business trip. Men in a good position, like he certainly was, often went away on business looking after their affairs. He might have gone to London. He was a member of some swell club there. That she did know, for he'd let out something one day on an important call being put through to his club in town, and he'd had to return to Rotherfield sooner rather than later. All the same, she found herself watching the posts, watching for the appearance of the telegraph boy he usually wired, and all the time she was watching. When she dusted the front room or went to fetch anything from the cupboard, she'd find herself come to a standstill in front of the window and stare up and down the road. By the end of the month, she admitted that it was a good piece over his usual absence. Her husband thought it funny too. They had a talk about it one evening when their daughter Irene was out at her shorthand class. She started the subject herself. She said, "What do you think about it, Harry? What's your real opinion? You can say right out what's in your mind, you know." They were sitting in the kitchen over the fire. He took up the poker and knocked the coal about with making a better blaze before he answered. Then he said, in a very thoughtful voice, "Well, of course he might be dead." She nodded her head. I've thought of that myself. So it seems fairly straightforward, and it's a couple discussing somebody that they know. But the man that they know that hasn't shown up is a man that pays this couple to sleep with the wife with the husband's consent, and everybody's completely okay about it. So that's where the story sort of sets up. It's a sex work story from the 1930s. It's a positive sex work story from the 1930s. It's quite funny, but it's also, I imagine, would have been incredibly scandalous, and no doubt one of the things that got her banned back in the day. But she spent a lot of time in England, a lot of time in Ireland, and I think kind of fell between two stools and gets very overlooked in the Irish canon. But I think she's an incredible writer. A lot of her work's out of print, which is another issue that comes up with a book like this. It's very hard to find the stories when they've long kind of disappeared and aren't in the public domain anymore. So Nora Holt is somebody that I'm always encouraging people to read, and that's just one example of her brilliant work.
Yeah, and I think she's such an interesting way of building in that story the relationship between the husband and wife as well, which is actually really touching and sympathetic. And it's another one of the elements of the work that has this freshness to it, even now after all of these years. And it's so interesting to look at the book in terms of the ordering of it, which is alphabetical, which is lovely because that kind of creates all of these intriguing contrasts. But just looking at the evolution of the Irish short story, and some of the male writers we're familiar with from that era and a little bit later who were, often banned, and the work is probably nowhere as near as challenging as that would be even today. I mean, it feels like a story that was written maybe in the 70s during a kind of a wave of feminism. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's completely. I mean, the thing I find every time you dig up older stories, you often find work that feels like it was written very recently. And that's the sort of measure, I think, of a good short story. It's universal, it's timeless, it doesn't go out of fashion. And I know sometimes we go through waves in Irish writing of, being very focused on the next big thing and, comic writing, or it has to be really funny, or it has to be whatever. And I think we can forget that there's a lot of very sad, lonely, melancholic stories set on farms and in tiny towns that people don't look fashionable to people anymore, but are exceptional writing and have stood the test of time. I think of somebody like William Trevor, who's also in this book, who's a beautiful writer. But yeah, there's a lot, and that's the thing with the book like this. You can sort of have a lot of very funny works, a lot of funny stories in here. There's a lot of genre stuff. There's a lot of ghost stories. There's writers you wouldn't expect to. Roddy Doyle's story is a ghost story. You wouldn't expect that from Roddy in this collection. So yeah, I always think that the short story is a place where writers sometimes go to experiment. They kind of write outside their comfort zone. I can't imagine Roddy writing a 300-page novel on the ghost story, but he ran amok in about 15 pages. And that's what I like about the form. It's somewhere you can go and sort of do something different outside of what you usually might write.
Absolutely. And I'd love to ask you a little bit, Sinead, just about the kind of the detective work that goes into putting together an anthology like these, because you mentioned that you'd anthologized Nora Holt, for example, previously, but were there other writers here that it was difficult to track down, or kind of came to you in this revelatory fashion where you thought, I can't believe I've existed this long and been so interested in this form and just never heard of this person before?
Yeah, for sure. And there are people, I mean, it's funny that I edited another collection, which was short stories by women from the north of Ireland. And I was chasing a writer called Kathleen Coyle, who I knew, and I could see from online, literary archaeology, that she'd published over 40 stories in an American magazine. You can't find them for love nor money, but she was in one anthology in 1929 that the National Library said that they had. And of course, I went in, got my 3 books out for the era, and when I took it out, it was a pamphlet that was with it and had been missing. So somebody had obviously filched it and ran off with it. But I was sort of that one that got away. And this time around with this book, I was talking to Professor Geraldine Meany, who was doing some work herself in the UK, and happened to say to her, well, you're in that library, you wouldn't have a quick look and see? And sure enough, it was there. And that kind of stuff happens all the time. There is that sense that you're going to miss a great gem, or you can unearth somebody. Jane Barlow is another writer at the start of this book. Elizabeth Cullen and I included, who's sort of Irish American. She only died this year. Published a lot of stories in the New Yorker, and her story is about going on a bad date with the guy to Howth. The guy is another writer in the book, I might add, and you can figure it out yourself. But it's 2 novels, 2 short stories, only died this year, and again I hadn't heard a word. And I always say it's academics are doing an awful lot of work on keeping people alive. It's always, whenever I start a project like this, I intend to sort of reach out to a load of people I know who are doing the kind of day-to-day work, who we don't lose writers like this as long as people keep reading the work and studying them. And not even in a non-academic way, but even a book like this will keep people, maybe they'll go, okay, Nora Holt, who's she? What can I get my hands on? And that's what I like. It will propel, and not just to dead writers, to Melatu and Blindboy. People who won't have read them maybe will go off and maybe start seeking out the work. And that's what I like about this. It's like a mixtape. It's like a miscellany,
Yeah, and that's kind of the wonderful part of it as well. I mean, there's a number of writers in here that I've been very familiar with, but I might not have come across their short fiction before. So it's been a real pleasure to dip in and out of that. And as you say, see the way that they experiment within that form. Would you like to read us another short extract, Sinead?
Yeah, I'm going to read. I mean, this is a writer that everybody would know and would associate with the short story, Sean O'Faolain. I think, I remember studying him in school. And is a wonderful writer and quite a comic writer. But the one thing I say about short stories, and I think, Kevin Barry describes it, you have to go in fast. You have to get people by the end of the first page. And I think, you can put down a short story based on it not being grabbed in the first few lines. And you don't have long. You've got 10 pages to reel someone in. So I think an opening is really important. And I think this is an example of cramming a lot of information into a very small amount of text. The story is called A Dead Cert by Sean O'Faolain. Whenever Jenny Ross came up to Dublin for a shopping spree or a couple of days with the Ward Union hunt, or to go to the opera, or to visit some of her widespread brood of relations in or around the city, or to do anything at all just to break the monotony of what she would mockingly call my life in the provinces, the one person she never failed to ring was Onie Flynn. And no matter how busy Onie was in the courts or in his law chambers, he'd drop everything to have a lunch or dinner with her. They'd been close friends ever since he and Billy Ross, both of them then at the King's Inns, had met her together 12 or 13 years ago after a yacht race at the Royal St. George. Indeed, they used to be such a close trio that before she finally married Billy and buried herself in Cork, their friends were always laying bets on which of the two she'd choose. And the most popular version of what happened in the end was that she let them draw cards for her. The first man, she'd cried gaily, to draw the ace of hearts. And according to this account, the last card in the pack was Billy's, and before he turned it, she fainted. As she was far from being a fainter, this caused a great deal of wicked speculation about which man she'd always realised she wanted. On the other hand, one of her rivals said that she'd faked the whole thing to get him. So you have to read on after that, and even all the thing about the hunt and the law chambers, it's so kind of snooty and but you want to keep reading. You want to know what happens next and get the backstory. And what happens when she goes to meet Onie now? So I love it.
It has the quality of a fabulous piece of overheard gossip, doesn't it?
It's very gossipy, yeah.
Yeah, this wonderful triangle, which plays out in the most surprising way. I have to say, I think that, and we'll let the readers read that final paragraph, but I just love I think you call it the divilment of that final paragraph, where we feel like there's another kind of a world and dynamic about to open out from this very dramatic scenario that we've had the chance to engage with. And I was kind of, with that particular story as well, I was kind of gripped by the lightness of it, in a sense. I mean, there's a real sense, I think, Sinead, of the Irish short story as the abode of the kind of misery memoir light, almost, but there's a huge amount of diversity in the anthology in terms of tone, like as you said earlier about Roddy Doyle's short story, which has this wonderful gothic flavour, but also an awareness of new Irish communities, cultural miscommunication and misunderstanding, and systemic racism as well. I mean, it's intriguing to see the gothic form explored in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, people forget that they think of short stories as, often quite a serious form, not to be approached by all writers and therefore can't be funny. And yet there's a lot of very funny stories in this book. In this story, actually, I think it's got one of the best descriptions of flirting I've ever seen in my life. It's really well done. And then I think, I remember the Colin Barrett story at the start of this book. I remember the first time I read that story about Bat, who's really sad and drinks cans up on his mom's roof, and I've never forgotten that character. I often you imagine that somewhere he's still up there on the roof, throwing back a few cans and sort of figuring out his life. And I think you can do it. Sometimes you think you need a whole novel to get into characterization and make someone jump out from a story, but I really don't agree. And I think there's a lot of it's a very, very bendy kind of form, I think.
It is, absolutely. And speaking of bendy forms, Blindboy, I'd love to move to you now and ask you to read from your wonderful story, Scaphism, for us. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, by the way.
I couldn't tell you. It's an ancient Persian word, so it's either scaphism or scaphism.
We're doing our best.
So will I crack into it?
Please.
Okay. So this is scaphism. The way the bottom of his jeans used to soak up the piss from the floor of the jacks would bring on that metallic taste on my tongue that I'd have before an epileptic fit. Every fucking Thursday after darts. He'd have those navy denims that you get in guineas, with all the unnecessary stitching around the thighs and the arse. They made him look like a giant toddler with a dirty nappy. Every Thursday, lads. Fat Macca and Ernie Colopy would be going head to head in a vicious tourney of darts. It was always the two of them in the final. Ernie would have went professional if it wasn't for women and liquor. Fine men. Without fail, though, this other fucking Egypt would be over for his first drop of harp. He'd drink it in this servile way, where we could all see his teeth through the pint glass. He'd drink his pint like the pint was telling him to drink it rather than him telling the pint to get drank. Then off to the jacks he'd go, and come back out with an inch of piss in the boot cuffs of his Guineas jeans. I couldn't go near my porter, because I'd be transfixed by the cuffs of his pants. I'd watch a centimetre of cold piss on denim creep up and darken his trousers. Capillary action. The ability of a liquid to flow in a narrow space without the assistance of, or even in opposition to, external forces like gravity. I'd stare at that exact definition on the screen of my Samsung to try and achieve a sense of control over the situation. By 10:15 p.m, he'd be on harp number 2, and a pack of scampi fries would be ordered. 10:25 p.m, and he was back into the jacks for his second piss. 2 inches of dark wet navy up his leg at this point, lads. Other people's piss. He's wearing the feculence of every man in this pub up his fucking leg. Get different trousers, man, to fuck. The heel of his black leather gola tacky would sometimes trap the bottom cuff of the pants leg, so he'd be standing on the end of his own pants. It would squelch. There'd be grains of sand on the soggy denim. From fucking where? There's no sand in this pub. By 11:20 p.m, the third piss would be had. He'd be half cut, leaning against the bar, belly hanging out of the cardigan, and the piss, boys, the piss would be 6 inches up his shin. Capillary action. Sucking up piss, contradicting Newtonian physics. He never even noticed. And that's what would hurt the most. He didn't even know what was happening to his own leg. Art Nocton and Julie Slattery would notice, because I'd see him staring. But they'd just fall back into their sherries. I tried to catch their eyes, maybe get some backup, sort this out, a mutiny, but no, cowards. At 11:45 p.m. or thereabouts, the piss would be threatening his upper shin. That's when the taste of metal would arrive in my mouth, like I'd licked a 9-volt battery, followed by a burnt almond sensation, and finally bad eggs. When the room would lose its place in time and shape no longer made sense, that's how I knew I was having an epileptic fit. I'd come around after, and Packy Willie the barman would have tonic water and ice for me with a slice of lemon in it. All that citrus and effervescence quinine would see me right and bring me back. Every Thursday, lads, swear to fuck, every Thursday. No one would notice anymore. No one knew why I'd droop into a fit. No one talked to me about it. No one knew it was because of that stupid bollocks and the capillary action of the piss on his floppy Guineas denim. At 12:10 a.m, she'd come in off the night shift, and I'd stroll over to him. He'd have the Grand Mariner in sparkling water waiting for her at the bar top, and she'd lean in and fucking kiss him. And the leg of her Garda uniform would rub off the shin of his capillary action piss pants every Thursday. When Anne came in, it meant the doors got locked and Art Nocton and Julie Slattery could take out their pack of Major and smoke indoors like it was 1985, and Packy Willie would turn on the Sanyo behind the counter with the 6-changer disc tray, Deacon Blue, Jimmy Nail, Shawadi Wadi, Prefab Sprout, Thomas Dalby, the Style Council, the Communards, Wham, Kajagoogoo, the solo efforts of Lamar from Kajagoogoo. He'd start dancing with his elbows and the belly over the belt and the top of his arse on show, squelching piss britches on the wood floor that had 8 generations of varnish and was black. She'd dance alongside him, with one of Julie Slattery's Majors sticking out of her mouth, clapping her hands like Darrell Hall, looking at him in the eyes, acting like myself and herself hadn't been married for 18 years. I'd sit up, looking at the screen of my Samsung. The battery would go at 3, so I'd read the back of a packet of King Crisps. At around 5:30 a.m., we'd all clear out. Barney Shanahan would collect them in a taxi, and I'd walk home. Every Thursday, lads. In the winters, I'd walk home in the pitch black, not a hint of light. I'd click my tongue like a bat. That way I'd hear a lamppost if it was near. The sound would bounce back at me. When it's November dark, the slip on the ground underneath, you have to dance with it, or it'll crack you open. The cold has such bitter presence that you can feel your way through it. It has rises and lumps. You can sense the lukewarmth of a hedge, the trail that a panting fox leaves, a little band of clammy air that you can grab like a rope and use it to drag your way up a boreen. In the summer, it'd be bright. I hated that. There's too much pomp and show to summer mornings. When it's winter and dark, you can get properly acquainted with your journey. You get its honesty. You get to know its fears, its intentions. There's areas of the Limerick countryside that can't be trusted purely on grounds of personal integrity. These are where people fall into ditches or drown in bogs. The area charms that person into their death. It's never accidental. I've walked them all with no eyes. I'd arrive back to the cottage at around 8 in the morning. No keys. I'd leave the hall door wide open to confuse the tinkers. That's when I'd be able to relax and have the first drink. I'd be away from the pressures of the pub and the piss britches. I'd keep the bottles of Tisky on the window where they'd be cold. This particular Friday morning, I couldn't find the opener. I scanned my belongings to see which one I was willing to risk breaking to open the cap. Not my Samsung, not the remote, not my lighter. Fuck it, it's the only one I have. Not Anne's hair straightener that she never collected. So I ripped the curtain pole off the wall, 7 foot long, some fulcrum on it. I jammed the bottle of Tisky in between 2 cushions on the couch with a heavy encyclopedia holding it in place, and opened it with the curtain pole from the other side of the room. Popped it off in 2 seconds, lads. What did I say? Fucking fulcrum. I haven't got a master's in physics for nothing. I had a fine lump of smelly sock hash that I got off the Costellos from Palace Green. Hums like black pudding when you burn it into the Rizla. I continued with the Tiskies until Judge Judy came on the television. She was talking to young ones who couldn't stop spending money and getting into debt. I'd been meaning to ring Anne's piss-trouser boyfriend for the best part of 2 years. I'd been meaning to tell him that I hoped himself and Anne would have good fortune in all their future endeavours. The Samsung was charged, and something about this particular episode of Judge Judy gave me the courage to ring his number, so I fucking did, lads. The phone was ringing. He answered. He was talking to me. I was going to tell him about the epilepsy. Tell him how silly it was, that I'd be getting fits over his piss pants. How I'd get so upset when himself and Anne kissed while dancing to the solo efforts of Lamar from Kajagoogoo. We'd all laugh about it. Maybe I'd call over for dinner some night. Fuck it. Maybe I'd dance with the 2 of them next Thursday. I'd smoke Julie Slattery's majors too, and clap like Daryl Hall with Anne and high-five himself. We'll all head back to their gaff in Barney Shanahan's taxi, drink Grand Mariner, have a devil's threesome. Why not? Breakfast, dinner and toast. But I didn't. I told him that I'd developed stage 3 cancer of my esophagus and needed to clear the air. I asked him to meet me by the river in Plassey, where we could fish for perch together. In fairness to him, he had no qualms about this and felt fierce sorry for me. I don't have stage 3 cancer on my esophagus at all though, lads. I left the house with an open Tisky in either fist. I'd no fishing rod, so when I made it as far as Castleconnell, I dropped into the spar for a ball of twine, a naggin of hussar for the rest of the journey, a litre of milk and a squeezy bottle of honey shaped like a gay bee. At Castledry, I found a branch of oak and inserted the twine onto the end of it, threw it over my shoulder. At the University of Limerick, I asked a girl to give me one of her earrings. She lashed it straight over. Not a bother, fair play to her. I put it on the end of the twine like a hook. I had the bones of a fishing rod on me, lads. When I got to the bank of the Plassey River, he was there. Decent enough rod he had too. Got it in Aldi the last time they had a fishing sale. Not that bad at all. Big welcoming smile on him. As I got closer, he doled out his fat hand in friendship. When I could smell his breath, I wrapped the twine around his neck and didn't stop pulling until his eyes closed. He lay flat on the sandy Plassey riverbank, sleepy by. Gorgeous evening. There's a pond a small bit upriver with stagnant water, near a little island, very quiet. I carried him up into my arms, pure cradling like, and went there. I tore the fucking ridiculous Guyanese jeans off him. first port of call and lobbed them into the river where they'd never give me another fit again. I found 3 old logs, hollow boys, great for floating, one under his back, tied his fat belly to that, one above his head with hands bound, and same with the feet, getting great mileage out of the Castle Connell twine, gas-looking cunt, balls naked, tied up to the logs, like a bachelor at his stag do in Liverpool, some crack. He woke up when I was rubbing the picnic honey all over his balls and arse. Roaring and shouting he was, so I started pouring the honey down his throat. We wouldn't get disturbed that way. I flaked a litre of milk over him too. This is the best bit though, lads. I gently floated him out into the middle of the pond. Logs doing their job at buoyancy, feeling proud of myself, very still water, so it was nice and calm, and there he was, drifting out. Not one move on him, eyes up to the sky, mad bastard. It was midday, so the horseflies were having a great time with the honey all over his goalies. Now, I know what you're thinking. What class of sick bastard comes up with this type of stuff? Who'd do this to their ex-wife's new lad? But they've been doing this for years, especially to adulterers. It's called scaphism. Perfectly legitimate method of execution. Look it up on your Samsungs. The Persians invented it. The flies will bite as he floats in the pond. The longer he floats, the more he'll shit and piss. This will bring more flies. Give it a day, and they'll lay their eggs. The maggots will hatch, and he'll still be alive, floating gently on his back, all tied up. The underside of him will get nice and putty-like in the water, and fat pike will take scalps out of his calves, trying to eat the worms. Maggots eating into him too. Only the soft, wet bits, though, like the mouth, the dick, the eyes, the nose, the ears, the arse. The maggots will accumulate so much that they'll cut off blood flow, causing early gangrene to set in. Don't blame me, lads. Blame the ancient Persians for inventing the slowest and cruelest method of death known to humanity. You'd think that methods like that get lost in the flow of time, forgotten in their barbarism, but they don't, because time doesn't flow. It creeps, capillary, up the universe's leg, ignorant of Newton's laws, slow and unnoticed by the weak, bringing the dark stain of retribution with it. I gaze up at the heavens, and they gaze back in boot-cut jeans and black leather shoes. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Blindboy. Rarely have I found so much poetry in so much gore. It's actually it's so beautiful. You know, it's such a beautiful image of chaos. It really, really is. Where did you first come across the concept of scaphism?
Well, the thing with that story, right? So history is I tell you a strange thing, Okorie. So when I write a story, what I try and do is I achieve a sense of flow. So I'm not really thinking too critically about what I'm writing. It feels like I'm sitting at a cinema watching a film that was made for me. And the interesting thing with that story is, so I wasn't actually aware when I was writing that story that my character was following the journey of that murder that happened in Limerick in the 1950s. And the thing about the story itself, and it's ironic actually, because one of the other stories in the Art of the Glimpse collection, 2 in 1 by Flann O'Brien, and Flann O'Brien isn't really known for his short stories, but that story by Flann O'Brien was a huge influence on me and my short story writing, because it showed me how you could use the spectacle of violence and brutality as almost slapstick comedy. And Flann, for me, what I love about that story and Flann's writing, it gives me the confidence to feel okay to use comedy in the short story form, which, as you mentioned earlier, you're kind of, you know, within the short story form, being funny is seen to devalue the work or something. And I don't see that. I love using humour. I don't see a problem having imagery that's poetic or imagery that can grab at your heart or be serious, but at the same time to have a story that's entertaining and that's funny. This is about someone who gets so annoyed. Well, no, really what it is, it's a story about revenge because he feels entitled to his ex-wife's love. He feels entitled to that, and that entitlement causes him to engage in the spectacle of violence. And the thing is with it is that he thinks it's about the piss on a man's leg, you know? So Flann O'Brien's story definitely showed me there how to use humor in a story, in a short story, in such a way that it doesn't take you away from the page. You don't laugh so much that you're not involved in the characters, you know, or involved in what's happening.
Yeah, yeah, and there's such psychology, I think, in the way that you're addressing it as well. You know, I feel like we've had this intimate glimpse into this man's life, and some of the imagery you use is just so gorgeous. I mean, that one quote about the fox and the column of air that you could pull your way along through the night with it. I mean, it's just gorgeous stuff, and
Thank you very
it
much.
does give us that kind of a sense of an empathy with this character, no matter what he's doing. And I think you had me at the bootcut jeans from Guyanese, because I actually think I've had a similar reaction to those in many pubs in the past, and hopefully at some stage in the future I will again. But I'm glad you spoke about Flann O'Brien, because I think there's a wonderful affinity between your approaches, and I think in Flann O'Brien as well, there's a kind of a great sense of the tragedy of human existence that informs
Hmm.
all of his humor and all of his darkness. And I think that that's a wonderful vein that runs through the anthology as a whole. And I think you see it in
Hmm.
the stories of Mike McCormick's wonderful short story, in the work of June Caldwell as well.
Oh,
And
she's
even as
great for that. June is fantastic for that.
fantastic. Yeah, yeah, she really is. She's such a live wire in the Irish literary scene. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Kevin Barry as well, because
Hmm.
the first time I read Scathism was in a recent issue of the Kevin and Olivia's wonderful anthology, The Winter
Hmm.
Papers. And I know that Kevin has been a kind of a champion of your work as well
Yeah.
over the years. Can you talk a little bit about working with Kevin in the past?
So with that, when I first got my book deal, and I was like, right, I'm ready to write short stories, and I come to the word literature from I suppose a place of naivety in a literary sense. My background is in music and art, but not necessarily in literature academically, and when I saw what can happen there is you can lack confidence. So when I started, I didn't have confidence to know, is what I'm doing good? And Kevin Barry's short stories, the one There Are Little Kingdoms, I think is the name of it, that was a huge influence on me. And Scaphism was one of the first short stories I'd ever written for the first collection. And what I did is I just emailed it to Kevin in its entirety, the first draft, and I said, what do you think of this? And he gave me back a lovely email going, you have it, you have it. You have what is needed to write good short stories. And that little bit of encouragement from Kevin Barry was enough for me to go, right, I'm writing an entire book, because he has no reason to be lying to me. It was genuine. And if this person who I admire tells me what I'm doing is good, then I can at least try. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. It is one of those things that makes such a difference, I think, in the life of every writer at some point. Just having somebody who has no agenda, or no
Yeah.
need to tell you that you've got some potential. Once they say that to you, it really is like a door opens completely.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and I'd love you to talk a little bit again. I know you touched on it earlier, but just about, I mean, you're one of our generation's kind of communicators. You speak to people
Hmm.
across so many platforms in so many different ways, whether it's through your podcast or social media or music. And do you find you have a different approach when you're sitting down to write a short story, rather than trying to plot out something for, your blog or your podcast or your BBC series recently? Do you find you've got to get yourself into a completely different headspace?
Yeah. It's much more private, obviously. Um,
Mm.
for me, what I'm always searching for is the feeling of flow. The stories that I write, I genuinely feel that they're inside me already. They're in my unconscious mind, and I need to find a space where I'm writing where they basically they leave me and they're on the page, and then afterwards I go, wow, how the fuck did I write this? And I write in this fashion with fire in my veins. And then the next day I go back with ice in my veins. And that's when I start looking at things like the prose, because the thing is, if you start nitpicking about technicalities when you're in the process of writing, it takes you away from the heart of it. And the heart of it is what I'm looking for. I want to tell a good story. I want like as you mentioned there, feeling empathy for that character. This is he's not a nice character, you know. This is an entitled character. He feels so entitled to someone's love that he feels justified in murdering their lover. This is not a nice character, but I want the reader to enter their head, to feel a type of entitlement, so that you can make your own mind up about them and be let down by them, you know what I mean? Rather than passing judgment. You know, if you pass judgment on a character and you tell people you're not to like this character, that's not engaging. You're not going to drag anyone into the page. And using a lot of, I like to use on-the-body techniques when I'm writing. I like to describe feelings, smells, tastes as a way to extract empathy from the reader so that they're straight into the page. Like I open up, the first line in that story is the way the piss went up his denims brought on that metallic taste on my tongue. That's the opening sentence, because I want someone to, first of all, the visualization of piss creeping up pants. We all know it, but it requires quite a lot to think of it. You're thinking about the journey of the water or the piss up the leg of the pants. And then I'm asking people to get that metallic taste on their tongue. You know what I mean? We all know the taste of licking a battery. So it's two kind of engaging on the body things, and I open with that, and then you've invited someone into the world. Then they've left their head and they're in the page, and then my job there is just to keep them from there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's so interesting, though. I think it's one of those things that all the writers in the room started nodding when you started talking about the writing with fire in your veins and then ice in your veins.
Yeah.
And for me, one of the things that keeps me going in my own practice is that wonderful week or so between, because I'm not as disciplined as you. If I write something, I give myself a week of feeling like an absolute god who's just written a work of staggering genius before I go back and have to take myself down a few pegs.
Yeah.
But thanks so much for that, Blindboy. That was really, really illuminating, and I think it's a story that people will both absolutely enjoy reading, but they'll love hearing a bit about the process behind. And talking of process, thanks. Talking of process, I'd love to move on to you now, Melatu, and ask us to share a bit from your wonderful story, which is also a story I think that works on a number of different layers and levels.
I'm going to start the story from the beginning. I'll read a little bit into the beginning and then move down a few pages if you're reading along with me, just to set the tone for the story. So everyone was already in as she had hoped. She sat on the first empty chair she saw, and when she had finished arranging herself, getting her pen and papers out, making sure her phone was switched off, zipping up her bag, she finally looked up and realized she was sitting directly opposite the leader. The large window behind him was slightly open. Outside, the weather was as unsettled as her disposition, as if he was ruminating on whether to rain or not. The sun had not also bothered to come out, leaving the sky an unpleasant grey. Today was her turn to present her work at the writers' group. The leader took a sip out of a paper cup on the table in front of him. "Can you read us into your work?" he asked the girl, placing the cup back on the table. "Where would you like me to start?" she replied, hoping he would want an extract only as he sometimes did. "Why don't you read it all?" he said, looking enquiringly around the room, like the thought had just occurred to him. She bent her head and started to read, stuttering her words. "But it was after you met Dermot that you started to write. He came to visit your mother 4 months after you arrived. He had been working in London for a few months, which was why you had never met him. Your mother introduced him as the nicest Irish man she had ever met. He told you eagerly that he had worked with a lot of charities in Africa and also did some work with Anti-Mona's organization. He spoke about his experiences through his work with the openness your pen pal letters used to have, which made you like him even though he was old like your mother. And your smile reached your eyes for the first time in a long while because his were not guided. He told you he hoped to get funding to run a project, helping migrant children and teenagers to integrate through football and dance. When your mother asked him from the kitchen, where she was preparing jollof rice with prawns for him, if one could be taught to integrate, you had jumped in and said you thought it was a great idea. He still responded to your mother's question and said he didn't think there were enough opportunities for people to integrate, to which your mother replied that the church, the school, the road, the shops, and the playground should provide enough opportunities for people to integrate if they wanted to. Your mother glimpsed the look of impatience on your face and answered you back with silence. You could tell him things you could not bring yourself to tell your mother. How you hurried with your shopping because the security men followed you around the shops blatantly. And about the man who got on the same bus with you from school. And how he would wave and smile, and you would wave and smile back. Until the day he told you he would give you €100 if you slept with him. You had started with the small things first. And then you started telling him bigger things. About your father and how in your head you had blamed your mother for leaving. And how you had always struggled with the anger and guilt but couldn't talk about it. Because the first time you tried to say something, your mother had stood up from the bed and said, "It always had to be about you," and walked out of the room. You told him how for a long time you had felt as if all your family had died when your mother left you behind to travel with your siblings, both of whom were young enough to go with her on her passport. He had nodded his head repeatedly, as if he heard the things you were saying and the ones you left unsaid. That your mother leaving you behind was her way of punishing you. He took you and your siblings to the cinema, and you knew by the way people's reaction to you that they found it strange, the way their eyes slid away when you caught them looking, the old white couple who mumbled and scowled at him, the black man who looked at you with contempt before turning his back on you, his arms folded across his chest, the young woman with 2 little children who smiled at you and said too brightly, "It's lovely today, isn't it?" You wondered if he felt as uncomfortable as you, but you couldn't read his expression. He started a conversation with the young woman, but did not include you. So you walked away to look at the sweets until it was time to go in for the movie. He got the funding for his project, and you went with your mother and your 9-year-old sister to watch your 11-year-old brother play on the migrants team. There were little groups formed around the pitch, the black group, 2 white couples that spoke to each other in a foreign language, and a large Irish group. Each group mostly ignored the other. When he came around later, he wanted to know if you thought the event was successful, but you dodged the question. You are yet to feel comfortable telling someone you thought something was grand when you didn't think it was. He told you his dream would be to run more integration football and to go to schools to give anti-racism talks. You told him then about the little children down the street, of perhaps the ages of 5 and 6, who persistently shouted "Blackie" at you whenever they saw you walking alone, and how their parents talked among themselves like they could not hear. He told you not to bother about them. You also told him about the girls in your college who told each other to mind their bags or made so much about their purses being in their bags whenever they wanted to use the toilet. He told you he didn't think the girls meant anything by it. And you wanted to tell him about the woman at church who told you that a traveler woman had said that travelers were no longer the lowest class since the arrival of Africans. And you wanted to tell him about the bus driver who dropped you 2 bus stops away from your stop because there was nobody else apart from you still in the bus. And you wanted to tell him about the man who followed your mother to a supermarket car park and told her that he wanted a BJ, and how your mother told you she had felt bad she didn't have what he wanted until she realized what he meant. You wanted to tell him all these things, but you didn't. You cried for a long time on your bed after he left, confused at how alone you felt with so many people around you. And the next day, you went into this same spa shop and bought a diary. "Thank you," the leader said, nodding encouragingly when she got to the end. He shifted through the papers in front of him, arranging them again and again before glancing around the room. "So, what does everyone think of the work?" A was the first to speak. "I'm surprised you wrote in a second person." The girl gave A an impassive smile. She wanted to show she could take any criticism. B tucked her hair behind her ear before speaking. "I think this story should have a bit of light and shade to it, so that it's not all bleak and negative." C: "I'm not sure what it is, but there is something about writing in the second person that prevents me from caring about the character. I always know I'm reading a work of fiction." The leader: "Why don't you think about breaking it up a little bit? Maybe give us a name somewhere." D: "Why don't we ask her why she used the second person?" She waited for someone to pose the question, but all she saw were expectant eyes raised in her direction. I didn't want to personalize it by using the first person and giving the character a particular voice. The leader, do you think you can break it up a little bit? Maybe use the second and third person? She gave him an all considerate nod. The leader, another thing I would have preferred was for the reader to be the one picking up on the xenophobia, like the incident on the bus. I saw it as a kind of paranoia on the part of the character, like the scene at the cinema where a woman was being nice and she completely misread it. That was exactly where I was going with the story. The girl turned eagerly to E. Glad someone had picked up on it. The character's paranoia. F. My only issue with the story was the lack of narrative thread. The comment irritated the girl. Does every story have to have the traditional plot trajectory? The girl wanted to ask F, but didn't. E. I think there's a narrative thread, the buying of the diary. F. I don't think that was enough. C. I like the part where she was told by her aunt of how the West perceived Africans. A. I thought that was a little melodramatic. C. It might be harsh, but the truth usually is. The girl nodded repeatedly to show both sides of the argument made sense. G. I think you should ground the narration in specific details so we can understand why the girl feels so much self-loathing and self-hatred. The girl felt a sudden urge to cry, so she scribbled on the paper she had read from self-loathing and self-hatred. The leader closed his notebook and said, okay, that's all for today. Who is presenting next week? F raised his hand. Thank you.
Oh, Melatu, thank you so much for that. It's a story that I've loved since I first read it in this hostel life, and I just love hearing you read it because it brings home, I think, all of the wonderful individual tragedies, the small individual tragedies that make up the main body of the story, and then just the wonderful absurdity of the writing group feedback, which had me kind of wanting to face palm at moments and laugh out loud at others. Can you talk to me a little bit about where the idea for the framework of the creative writing workshop came from?
Just like Blindboy. Can I call you the full name? Oh,
Yeah, Blindboy is fine, Melatu.
The Blindboy. Okay. Just like you mentioned, as in the place where writing comes from. I think sometimes writing, you kind of pour out some kind of emotions on paper, and then you look at it critically to try to, to phrase it in a nice way or to make it, a bit digestible, I'll say, to the reader. And I think with this story, the main part, as in the diary entry, was actually, was the main story for me that I wrote initially, and then I presented it at a real writing club or group, and the comments and all that all those comments were real comments, and I went back and I thought, how am I going to break up this story to make it more palatable in a sense, because there seems to be a kind of almost like a withdrawal or an unconscious withdrawal from the group in terms of reading, like it was too maybe harsh for them to digest. And going home, I thought about it and I thought, okay, I don't want to break up this story. I don't want to make it nicer. I don't want to make it, play around it in such a way that to appeal to somebody else reading it in terms of making it light and shade. I thought, okay, the only way I can do this is to frame it around this other story, and and that seemed to work in a way. And that was what I did. I don't know if it works or not, but then that's what I did because I didn't want to break up the main diary story. I just didn't want to touch that bit,
Yeah. But I think it's such a clever device because it really, for me, emphasizes how much in Irish society we just don't want to admit that there are all of these power dynamics and power exchanges and little microaggressions in everyday life. And I think it's a very Irish trait to want to ignore that, and to downplay it. And I think that the framing device of this just really brings, the difficulties faced by this character to the fore in a way that, again, as we were saying with Blindboy's piece, it creates that empathy, and it works so well. But I'd just love to talk to you a little bit about your own work in kind of teaching creativity, with regards to the way you portray that particular workshop. And do you find that your own attitude to teaching others creativity has been changed and developed by your own experience of having undergone that process, whereby, of course, we know that people are well-meaning, but I mean, some of the stuff that comes up again and again, and even the thing about the narrative thread, I think everyone who's at a story workshop is throwing their eyes to heaven at that moment.
For me, when I'm teaching, I don't usually teach creative. I've never taught creative writing to adults. It's usually to younger children, and so it's a different dynamic altogether. And I come to it from the a process of probably using language, playing around language when you're writing as a writer. So it's a different dynamic, all the same. So usually there are. With children, they're more open, so you're not reading, probably if there are adults in the room, you might kind of read certain kind of body language, but then, hopefully they're relaxed towards the end of the, the class or the workshop. And with my workshops, I try to make it fun. I try to do everything I can just that people would have because I find writing a very serious, and to be in a group together where you have to write, it's awkward. It's and some people I find it very difficult to when I'm a writing group to be told, okay, you have to write something immediately. I find that very difficult as a person to create like that. So usually I prefer to, if I just take in the information and then I go home and I produce something. So it works for me better. So I come with teaching or in being in a creative writing workshop with that experience and knowing that this is my. So I understand if other people are reluctant to write, so I try to make it fun. I try to make it not to be judgmental or competitive. It's just about doing something and having fun with it, and no one is reading no one is comparing it to the other person's work. No one is so it's just about everyone having fun. And
Yeah, and I think there's something about learning to be a writer yourself, which is about learning a kind of a self-protection as well, isn't there? Because we do leave ourselves very vulnerable when we share our work, and people
definitely
do have a set of responses that they come back with on work. But I was just thinking again, I love how you depict contemporary Dublin in this particular story. And going back to your collection, This Hostile Life, I think one of the things that you do so well is build and create and share community dynamics, whether it's the story that's set in a direct provision centre, this story which talks about new Irish communities in contemporary Dublin, or the final story in the collection which deals with Nigerian communities and mythologies. Do you find yourself drawn to covering lots of different locations in your work and different settings? And is that something we'll see in new work going forward as well?
I think every writer, in a sense, you think about, as you're thinking about your character, you're thinking about the setting where your character lives. You think about everything comes, the language they use, everything comes into play. Sometimes you might have a particular. I think if you put a character in an environment that does not suit the character, it might not work in a sense. So I like to move around. I like to think about. A lot of times people mistake the story, as in the girl in the story, as if she lived, she was living in direct provision, and I had to correct that and say, no, actually, this is not a story based on direct provision, because I think the responsibility or that is done in terms of it only happens in such places, and I'm saying no, it actually happens right next door to you, and so that's so I had to put that out there a lot of times. But I think that you have to look at the environment in which you're writing, and you think about that, and it has to suit the story that you're writing about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just, in terms of the anthology as a whole, were there any other stories that you felt really spoke to you and your form of writing and your approach that you've had a chance to look at so far?
There were so many stories that I liked. So, but just to talk about the one that stood out to me in terms of my own form of writing and how the characters that I like to create, that would be Maeve Brennan. Am I pronouncing her story right? And that would be The Morning After the Fire. Like, I just love the character that was just exactly the kind of the character that goes around, sees everything around them in terms of reporting what's going on. I think she did that. So the little girl in the story was so beautifully drawn, like it's just everything was put into it. Her sense of I don't want to use the word entitlement, but her sense of entitlement to the story, to telling the story of the fire, and how she went around the neighborhood telling that story. I always like when I read stories that have characters who are very that have that sense of that have observed quite a bit and have that sense of not only do they observe, but they have this way of telling the stories, somebody else's story, but they tell it so well and they own the story. I always love those characters. So that I got into that story, from get-go. I loved it completely, adored it. Yeah, I've heard of her, and now I'm going to read more of her work. Just reading that story, that she's great.
That's wonderful.
And there were other stories as well. So
yes, yeah, and I think that's true. Though what you say about Maeve Brennan is true about all of your protagonists that I've read so far. Melatu, is that we really enjoy time spent viewing the world through their eyes, and we observe. We enjoy what they observe, but also their observations too, which make the work really, really rich. And it's just lovely to hear from the two of you which stories spoke to you. Because I think what Sinead has done here and achieved so well is kind of creating a new family tree for Irish writing, which we can go back to now and kind of reassess and tease out so many of different connections in tone and preoccupation and form, which would be hard to do if it weren't for an anthology of this scope and size. That's not to say you can't fit it in your bag and bring it on the bus, as we were talking about earlier. So I'd just like to thank you all again so much. But before we finish up, one of my favourite things over the past while has been coming across the Spotify playlist that Sinead has made for the book. Which we shared on Twitter probably about a week ago now, Sinead. But I'd love to ask you both, Blindboy first, Going Out West by Tom Waits. What was it that made this song? Was this going through your head while you were writing the story?
Yeah, I mean, that song, so Tom Waits is a songwriter who I would class him as a short story writer. There's a few songwriters, Tom Waits and Randy Newman is another, who they write songs and those songs are short stories. And it's, when I write short stories, a lot of the times what I'm being influenced by are songwriters as opposed to writers of short stories. And Tom Waits' a song, Going Out West, it's just about a tragic, violent male character who is from some town on the outskirts of America, and he plans on going to Hollywood and becoming a star, and he's very intent on going out west where the wind blows hard, and he's got real scars, he doesn't need any makeup, and as soon as he gets to Hollywood he's going to be a success. But by the tone of the music and everything that it's like, no, it's not going to work out like that. You're going to find yourself very, very disappointed, and you may even get arrested. You have a vision of Jean-Claude Van Damme in your head, and this isn't how it really is, but he thinks it is. And it's just a beautiful short story. Yes, it's a song, but it's a beautiful short story. And the energy of that, the unreliable narrator, I'm always fascinated with the unreliable narrator. The world is told through the lens of this character, and you don't know as a reader whether you can trust their lens. Everything about the world is filtered through their lens, which is broken in some way. Tom Waits does it really well, and so does Randy Newman. So that's why I chose it. There is a lot of going out west in my story,
Yeah, there's that kind of that absolute delusion, and also that sense of tragedy. And again, like, I'm the Egypt here who empathizes obviously with the damaged male. But yeah, I do think Tom Waits, he is a master storyteller, and he creates room for the listener within the song. Like, there's that kind of ironic gap that we find ourselves in from the very beginning, which is just brilliant. and I'm definitely going to go back to that when I haven't listened to that particular album for a while. And Melatu, I had never heard the song Jailer by Aisha before, but I'm going to be listening to loads more of her stuff. Talk to me a little bit about that. It's a gorgeous piece.
Oh, unlike Blindboy, I wasn't. It wasn't that I didn't listen to it while I was making my writing the short story. But when Sinead, sent the email about thinking about songs that that we think would go in terms of the story, I thought, okay, this is it. It came to mind immediately because he was talking about racism and post-colonialism and all of that. So, and I think that that's just with all the things that are going on, I think I listened to that song recently, and it just hit me because it speaks about those issues or those themes and it's almost like it calls or she calls the whole system of colonialism. It's like Mr. Jailer having a jailer, and it's an interesting song, beautifully written, and I don't want to go into the whole colonialism and racism issue, but then this is what the song is about, and I think that touches on the story in a way as well. So.
Absolutely. And I think it serves, as the story does, as a kind of a call for empathy and just that call to place yourself in the shoes of somebody else, and a reminder that just because we haven't personally experienced an issue doesn't mean that our society isn't absolutely rife with it. So I thought it was a beautiful accompaniment to the piece. And Sinead, what drew you to what tempted you to put together this list?
I'm kind of obsessed with other people's Spotify lists. I was a music journalist for years and used to write about music, and there's a lot of music in constellations. And I just thought it'd be an interesting idea to see another little kind of window into what people would pick. And obviously I can't pick one, but I kind of think of this book is like a sort of, 5 a.m, Kamalia, that 100 people have to sing a verse and you're not allowed to get out of singing your verse. You have to do it. So it's a big old kind of late night ballad that everybody has to, and you're not allowed to step aside. You have to kind of contribute, and it is that sort of thing. It's a sort of a round robin, and if you look at this collection, you'll see lots of stories that are actually weirdly in conversation with each other. Elaine Feeney has a brilliant story about Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes going to see Richard Murphy on Inishbofin, and there's another story from 100 years before by Charlotte Riddell, also set on Inishbofin, and they weirdly are in a kind of conversation, and which Elaine couldn't have known. None of the writers had seen the book till it came out. Those sort of little echoes happen, and they happen in the music as well. I mean, I think there's more. Van Morrison was picked more than once for the Spotify playlist by 2 different people as well. So it's funny, of all the songs you could pick, and Van gets in there twice.
I think Van's
I personally, I really love the fact that you put that you'd asked for that as well, Sinead, because it's what I come from a multidisciplinary approach when I write, and when I get asked about my writing, usually from journalists, it's always about who are you reading, and often I want to say, well, I'm reading this, but I'm listening to that, and I'm watching this. And today, in 2020, if you're a writer, you're not just taking your influences exclusively from other writers on a page. I'm taking it from multiple different things around me, other pieces of art, other mediums. When I write prose on a page, sometimes I hear melodies in my head, I hear a beat. I'm writing a song for the paragraph. Do you know what I mean? So it was lovely to be asked that, because it's the first time I was ever asked. How is music related to your writing process? And I'm like, fucking thank you for asking that.
No, I did one for constellations as well, because as I say, there's an awful lot of music in constellations, so I have a constellations playlist. But I was asked a separate question about the book I'm trying to write myself now, and I said it was sort of set in a very obscure place, and that one of the things that has kind of weirdly overlapped, which also has a weird Art the Glimpse collection or connection, is I've been watching The Third Day, which is this very strange midsummer Wicker Man type TV series, and there's been 3 episodes, and there's 3 more, and in the second 3, Kit Duval, who has got a story in the Art of the Glimpse, is one of the writers. But that kind of TV thing is having more of an influence on, because it's set in a very remote place, and the book I'm writing is set in a very remote place. And I think tonally we bring things in from film and art and music, and it isn't just as Blindboy says, it's not just other writers. It's it is the art. It's a big kind of Venn diagram. It all overlaps.
Yeah, and I think that's what we see with this anthology is this wonderful Venn diagram coming together. And one of the things I've taken from today's conversation is how all of you are working, kind of picking illusions and inspirations from the air and from wherever you can. And I think that is what creativity is, isn't it? It's just being open and attuned to those things. And I think we create the art that we're happiest with ourselves when we have been able to raid our own kind of personal box of treasures for the various different influences that are coming our way and make something fresh with them. And I think when those things are very, very fresh, then natural dialogues occur. And speaking of dialogues, I think I've probably kept you all long enough, but I'd like to thank you all so much. Sinead, thank you for putting this anthology together. Melatu and Blindboy, thank you for sharing your gorgeous words sites with us, and thank you to our viewers. Now go and buy the book for yourself and your grannies and your aunties and your uncles and everyone you know.
Thanks, lads.